what I hope to do, starting with today being part 1, is inshallah outline the story of Prophet Musa in the Qur'an. And I can imagine this might take a couple of sessions, but we will go through it quite thoroughly and methodically. And when we look at the story of Musa alayhi salam in the Qur'an, Musa alayhi salam is one of the most mentioned prophets. He is mentioned across so many different surahs. And there is a reason why Allah constantly mentions prophets in the Qur'an. Musa alayhi salam is just one of about 25 other prophets that are mentioned in the Qur'an. We have chapters in the Qur'an named and mentioned after numerous prophets. Prophet Yunus, for example, Prophet Yusuf, Prophet Hud alayhi salam. These are all surahs and chapters that we have in the Qur'an that are named after these prophets. And why is it exactly that Allah wants us to think about what the prophets went through? Why is it that Allah wants us to read their stories, to think about their stories? Now there's a beautiful verse at the end of Surah Yusuf. After the whole story of Yusuf is explained, Allah goes through what happened to Yusuf alayhi salam. The story of Yusuf finishes on verse 101. The last verse within Surah Yusuf, Allah now explains the philosophy or the reason why He wants you to read these stories. He explains why He has mentioned these stories in the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قِصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. This is the first reason. Now when you read these stories, there is something called ibrah. Now ibrah is this idea that you take a lesson from it. In Arabic, ibrah comes from ayn ba ra, it means to cross. So what you're doing when you're reading this story is you're crossing over from simply just reading. You're now putting yourself in the shoes as if you're in that story. You're now relating with the Prophet. You're now getting into that story, understanding the motives, understanding the agendas, understanding the pain that the Prophet went through, or the Prophets went through. And this is one of the reasons why Allah has mentioned this. And He says, لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, for those who reflect. These stories are mentioned so that we can think about them. Then Allah continues, مَا كَانَ حَدِيثًا يُفْتَرَى, that these stories are not fabricated. These stories that Allah mentions are stories that are true. They actually happened, and Allah wants you to take them as if they are true. Then Allah says, وَلَكِنْ تَصْدِيقَ الَّذِي بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ, that they confirm what is in your hands. And this is the third point from this verse. That these stories that Allah relates about the prophets, one, it's for ibrah. Two, it's for it's a true story, it's not a story that's fabricated. Thirdly, it is a tasdeeq, meaning it confirms what is in your hands. So thirdly, within this verse, it is a confirmation of what is in your hands. Here, the reference is being made to previous scripture, previous revelation. That revelation which is within the hands of the Ahlul Kitab. This story that we have, these stories that is meant to confirm, to verify, to correct what is in the hands of the Ahlul Kitab. Then it continues, وَتَفْصِيلٌ لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, وَتَفْصِيلُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, and it explains with details in regarding to some of these stories. So very interestingly, there are details within the Qur'an that you won't find within previous scriptures. Here, the Qur'an is coming to rectify, to clarify. So for example, when you think of Musa alayhi salam and his story, one of the big incidents and events is the incident of the golden calf. We all know that story, what happens there. In our understanding from what we have in the Qur'an and in our literature, it was Samiri, the one who created the calf, the golden calf. But when you go to the biblical narrative, you'll be shocked to see who they ascribe the act to. They say it was Harun who did this. They say it was Harun who was the one who made the golden calf. So here we have this idea that the Qur'an, when it's mentioning these stories, it's doing so in a way to correct what was in the hands of the Ahlul Kitab and what was being spread about the prophets. So one reason why, another reason why, is that Allah wants to clarify now. He wants to correct this narrative. that the Ahlul Kitab are speaking about Harun in this way. The Ahlul Kitab are speaking about Sulaiman alayhi salam in this way. So for example, one thing the Ahlul Kitab say about Sulaiman is they said that he created places of worship for idols. This is something to us that is astonishing. It's outrageous that Sulaiman alayhi salam would do this. But this is something that is commonly believed amongst the Ahlul Kitab. Such to the extent that even within the Qur'an, Allah comes and says, مَا كَفَرَ Sulaiman. That Sulaiman alayhi salam did not do kufr. Now you might read that without knowing the context of what's going on in the world of Ahlul Kitab and think, why is Allah now clarifying and giving and clearing the slate from Sulaiman? It's because the Ahlul Kitab had an opinion of an event of what happened. And Allah's coming to clarify what's going on there. The fourth thing is that it's an explanation. And then the verse continues, it's a guide. وَهُدًى, and then it continues, وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً لِقَوْمٍ يُؤْمِنُونَ. That indeed these stories are a guide. When you read the story, not just of Musa alayhi salam, you read the story of Ibrahim, you feel his pain, you walk in his footsteps when he breaks the idols, he's now being thrown into the fire, you're there. Allah wants to make you describe. Allah describes it in such a way that it feels personal to you now. He wants you to imagine it. He wants you to think, wow, what is Ibrahim going through? How did he overcome this challenge? And this is the guide that we find in these stories. And again, it's a mercy, because why? We see how Allah protected these prophets. When we see the way Allah protected Ibrahim, for example, he turned the fire cool, that's a mercy for us. And that Lord that protected Ibrahim, he is there to protect us as well. After everything that, for example, Yusuf alayhi salam went through, and he was made into royalty, given nobility, again, that's a mercy. You realize Allah is there, He's looking after you. It may not be going well now, but keep in mind, the end is in Allah's hands. So that's to do with why does Allah narrate stories. Now, moving on to the next slide. Why the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam? So I mentioned that Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he is one of the most frequently mentioned prophets in the Qur'an. He appears in many surahs, and his story is almost mentioned in the Qur'an in a way that's meant to grab your attention. Now you imagine you're a Muslim in Mecca, you've been persecuted, you now have to live a life of fear, of being living a life under threat. You don't know what the Quraysh are going to do to you. Then the Qur'an reveals a verse, for example, هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ مُوسَى. This is verse 9 of Surah Taha. هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ مُوسَى. Now imagine, you've heard this revelation now come down. You're being told, have you heard the story of Musa? Now you've gone from being scared to being what? Excited. We now realize just how Musa alayhi salam had a journey. We have a journey, and we will continue on this journey. Allah is there to protect us. هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ مُوسَى. This is Allah begins discussing the story of Musa alayhi salam in Surah Taha. Has it come to you? This amazing news of Musa, has it come to you? If it hasn't come to you, sit down, get your chai ready, I'm going to tell you. Because this is an amazing story that you need to be aware of, to be inspired by. The other, number two, is his story is a beautiful story that contains many different themes. It contains many different elements. It's a very rich narrative of faith, oppression, injustice, psychology, community building, faith, worship of God, monotheism, being loyal to God, being tempted by this world. There are so many different things that we can pick up in this story. Thirdly, it's a link between us and Ahlul Kitab. This story forms the bulk of the Torah, you could imagine. The Old Testament, when you look at the Old Testament, in particular the first 5 books, you've got Genesis to Deuteronomy, you have Exodus, you have Leviticus, and you have Numbers. These first 5 books of the Old Testament, 4 of them are to do with Musa alayhi salam. It's a huge chunk of their story. And there's a reason why Allah brings it into our life as well, into Islam as well. Why? Because Islam is a continuation. There are elements of that story that we should be aware of as well. There are elements of that story that impact us today. Now, interestingly, when it comes to the story of Prophet Musa, it doesn't necessarily end very well for him. I'm not going to give too many spoilers, but I'm sure you all know. Unlike the story of Prophet Yusuf, for example. Prophet Yusuf, his story described in the Qur'an, Allah explains it as ahsan al-qasas, the most beautiful story. Why? Because it's got every feature of a good movie. It's got someone who's a victim, he's then oppressed, he's then taken from his home, he's taken as a slave, he's now a stranger in a new land, he's then made into nobility and royalty, but that took time, it took patience, he had to undergo a lot of injustice, but it ends well for Yusuf alayhi salam. And he brings his family with him, and they will sit on the throne, and they all settle down in Egypt. This is how the story of Yusuf alayhi salam ends. But the story of Musa alayhi salam doesn't end so well, despite it accomplishing so much. Despite their overcoming the threat of Pharaoh, they then end up wandering into the desert for many years. And lastly, one of the beautiful things about this story is it reaffirms and really makes us appreciate more about this revelation that the Holy Prophet had. It makes us affirm and believe in him even more, because we see how accurate and how on point his recollection or the revelation that came to him was about Musa alayhi salam. There are certain things in the story that only now historians and archaeologists are actually able to affirm and testify to. So for example, the mentioning of Haman, one of the characters within the story of Musa, a builder or a minister within the government of Pharaoh who was in charge of building and quarries, his name was Haman. And for the longest time, the Christians would say the reference of Haman in the Qur'an is a mistake. Because in the Bible, the character Haman belongs in a different story. It belongs in the story of when the Jews were in Babylon. What they say is that the Prophet, when he was copying the Bible, because their accusation is that the stories that we have are copies, and the Prophet merely copied the Bible, they copied the Torah. What they say is that the Prophet, when he was copying this, he made a mistake. He brought Haman from a different story in the Bible and he brought it into the story of Musa alayhi salam. But very interestingly, recently, scrolls have been discovered that show that there was a figure at that time in Egypt by the name of Haman, who was actually in charge of quarries and building at that time. And we realize, wow, subhanAllah, despite hundreds of years them throwing accusations at the Prophet, in fact, no, the Prophet's recollection through revelation, his conveying the story to us is actually what is accurate. And I think there's a sixth one actually, but I don't want to put it down on the slide. And the sixth one perhaps might be the most important, and we'll touch on this as we go through, is understanding the story of Musa alayhi salam helps us understand the story of Bani Isra'il. Musa alayhi salam, his destiny and his journey is intertwined with Bani Isra'il. You cannot take the two of them apart. When you read the story of Musa alayhi salam, you are reading the story of Bani Isra'il pretty much. Reading the story of Bani Isra'il at that time, when they were receiving revelation, when they had a prophet amongst them, helps us understand today certain behaviors that we see amongst communities that consider themselves to be amongst Bani Isra'il. When we see, for example, the destruction in Palestine, we see the open killing, the almost delight that they get in killing children, the way they think they can get away with it, the arrogance that you see very clearly. And I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, I don't need to go into details. The arrogance, the delight, the joy that comes from this destruction, this arrogance, we'll see it in this story. And we'll see elements that will make you think, wow, how is it that such a people can be arrogant? This arrogant to their prophet, that they know this prophet has been sent to them. They know that Allah has favored them, yet this level of disbelief. Then you come today and you see certain behavior, and we'll go through it, and you'll see the correlation very clearly, and you'll understand the problem that we have in today's world. Okay, so very quickly, in order to set the scene, so I appreciate today is part one of Prophet Musa, but we won't actually fully get to the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. what we're going to do, or what I'm going to try to do, is set the historical context in which Musa alayhi salam came. In order for me to do that, I first need to introduce you a little bit to the timeline that we have of our prophets. So as you can see there, sorry, it is a bit small. I did ask Claude 100 times to make it bigger, but it really struggled a little bit to do that. Well, you can see at the beginning you have Adam alayhi salam. Then after him you have Ibrahim. Now that's an error on the screen. You have Nuh alayhi salam comes in the middle. You have Adam alayhi salam, and then you have Nuh. These are sort of the big prophets, the more well-known prophets. Between Adam and Nuh alayhi salam, you obviously have other prophets. You have Sheikh, you have Idris. But in terms of the big main prophets, you have Adam alayhi salam, and then you have Ibrahim. Ibrahim is probably the first prophet we can actually trace the time back to some confidence. These dates that we have here are not 100% accurate, but they're reasonable. They've been put together by historians using support of archaeology, using support of biblical references as well, and even some hadith that we have. However, I won't say it's 100% accurate, but it's reasonable to understand the timeline like this. So you have Ibrahim alayhi salam, then after him you have his children, then you have Musa alayhi salam, then Musa up until Isa. When Isa alayhi salam is sent, that is when the story of Bani Isra'il ends. From the time of Ya'qub to Isa alayhi salam, that is the window of Bani Isra'il. When Isa alayhi salam comes, that is when the covenant or the blessing that were given to Bani Isra'il was now taken. That's it. Allah said at that point, enough's enough. You've had so many years, despite all of the prophets that have come to you, despite all of the blessings that have come your way, it's not going to work anymore. And this prophecy or this revelation were taken from them. And we have verses again that says they were cursed, they were taken away, they were taken from a position of honor in the eyes of Allah, and they were made humiliated because of what they did. So we see after Isa alayhi salam there's a gap, then our holy prophet comes, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then I've put in, it's quite small actually, 874. Does anyone know what I'm referring to actually? I put that date in to see if anyone knows what I'm referring to. What event happened? It's 874 in our Gregorian calendar. It's 260, I believe, Hijri. That's when the minor occultation started. So you can see when we look back in history, what are we looking at? 260, 265, that's on. So we see this is the timeline of our prophets. A significant amount of prophets went to Bani Isra'il at that time. After Isa alayhi salam, there was a gap, then we had our holy prophet, then we had the imams, and we had occultation. So from 874 to now, there's been no physical presence of an infallible or from someone who is the representative. Now, moving on, this is now zoning into Bani Isra'il. Now, Bani Isra'il refers to the sons of Ya'qub. Now, Isra'il was a name given to Ya'qub. In the Semitic language, it means the servant of God. Isra means servant. Il was a reference to Allah. Isra'il was a title given to Ya'qub, which meant the servant of Allah. Banu Isra'il refers to his children. Now, as you can see in this graph, we have Ibrahim alayhi salam. He has two sons, Ismail and Ishaq. Ismail is where our prophet takes his lineage. That's where the holy prophet traces his lineage back to Ibrahim. Ishaq then had Ya'qub, and Ya'qub alayhi salam then had these sons, or what's referred to as the 12 tribes. Now, very interestingly, each tribe had its own destiny. This is the beautiful thing about that story. If you want to go into the detail, each tribe had its own destiny, it had its own leaders, as the story progresses, and this is beyond the time of Musa alayhi salam, this is now going on to the prophets after Musa. Each tribe was allotted a different role within Bani Isra'il. There were some tribes that were specifically warrior related. If you were a soldier, you came from a specific tribe. If you were a merchant, you belonged in a specific tribe. If you were a prophet, you belonged in a specific tribe. If you were a king or a prophet, you belonged in a specific tribe. And you can see, for example, from the tribe of Levi came Musa and Harun. From the tribe of Judah, which was the tribe in which kings came from, came Dawood and Sulaiman and Isa alayhi salam. Now, out of the 12 that I have colored in, there are 2 that remain uncolored. There are 2 that are white, and that is Levi and Judah. And that is just to reference a historical incident that happened, which is in the 7th century, Jerusalem was attacked, or Bani Isra'il were attacked by the Assyrians. At that point, the Assyrians attacked Bani Isra'il with such violence that 10 of these tribes became lost. They were dispersed, they were scattered, they were taken as slaves, they were scattered amongst the people. And within biblical history, they're referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. As a punishment for the filth and the disgust that they used to do, these tribes were now lost. The tribes that continued were Levi and Judah. Now, interestingly, when the Quran speaks about the Jews, what does it say? Yahudi. Yahudi. Yahudi refers to those from the tribe of Judah. Because when the Prophet is now there, the only tribe that remained from Bani Isra'il were those from the tribe of Judah. So Allah now calls all of the Jews, or Yahudi, they call them Yahudi now. Why? Because they all took their lineage from Judah. The other tribes were non-existent. They had been destroyed. What is actually very interesting here as well is, if you notice, Yusuf alayhi salam had his own tribe. But no prophet came from the tribe of Yusuf. No prophet came from the tribe of Yusuf. And we have some hadith within our books that explain why. And it says that when Yaqub came to when Yaqub came to Egypt, Yusuf alayhi salam didn't show the respect to Yaqub that he should have. Okay, now this is a tradition that we have, and this is a tradition that people like to mention. This is a problematic tradition for many different reasons. One, Yusuf alayhi salam was a prophet of great standing, great akhlaq, and great ethics. Even this hadith that we have doesn't make sense according to our own standards. It's a contradictory hadith, and it goes against the way the Quran builds up Yusuf alayhi salam. But it's interesting to know, for whatever reason, Allah decided no prophets from the lineage of Yusuf alayhi salam. Prophets came from the lineage of Levi. Now, if you remember, has anyone seen the series Yusuf alayhi salam? Yes. You've seen the series. If you haven't, it's a great series to watch. It's available online, English subtitles, I think, if you search it up on YouTube. Levi was the brother that suggested that we don't kill him, we throw him in the well. So there are some ahadith that say that the reason it went into Levi's lineage is because of his goodness. Again, I don't agree with that idea. I still think he supported the throwing of Yusuf alayhi salam into the well. That itself is quite a significant issue. But for whatever reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided that the clergies and the rabbis and the prophets were to come from the lineage of Levi, who was one of the 12. Okay. Now, why exactly did Allah decide to do this? What was the reason behind why Allah elevated Bani Isra'il so much? And there are a number of different reasons given, or I suppose hypotheses given, why Allah decided to do this. It's quite hard to understand. That's Allah's wisdom. We can simply try to get an educated guess as to why He has done this. There are 2 verses. Oh, sorry. What blessings were they given? I jumped the slides. What blessings were they given? So these 2 verses speak about different blessings that they were given. The first verse says, Ya qawm idhkuru ni'matallahi alaykum. This is Musa alayhi salam now speaking to Bani Isra'il when they're in the Sinai. They're in the wilderness, he's reminding them of the blessings. O my people, remember Allah's blessings upon you when He appointed prophets over you. Ya qawm idhkuru ni'matallahi alaykum idh ja'ala fikum anbiya. He appointed prophets amongst you. وَجَعَلَكُمْ مُلُوكًا. He made you rulers. وَآتَاكُمْ مَا لَمْ يُؤْتِ أَحَدًا مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. And He gave you of such blessings that He didn't give anyone. So here we have, they were given nubuwah. That's one thing they were blessed with. The other thing that they were blessed with was with mulk, or muluk, or rulers, or sovereignty. They were given the ability to have their own rule. The next verse, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحُكْمَ وَالنُّبُوَّةَ وَرَزَقْنَاهُمْ مِنَ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَفَضَّلْنَاهُم عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. Now indeed we gave them the book, we gave them prophethood, and we gave them of things and favored them above all others in the world. So these are the blessings that they were given in a nutshell. They were given prophethood, they were given the kitab, meaning revelation, the Torah. They were given sovereignty. This is a big thing in the history of Bani Isra'il, that they had land and that they had kings. And they were given of many things of which people before them and even people after them have not been given. Now, why were they blessed? This is the question I wanted to ask previously. We have two verses which are very interesting, which some Mufassirin have alluded to, that this might be one of the reasons why. It says, وَآتَيْنَا مُوسَى الْكِتَابَ وَجَعَلْنَاهُ هُدًى لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. That we gave Musa the book and we made it a guidance for Bani Isra'il. And what is the message then given? أَلَّا تَتَّخِذُوا مِن دُونِي وَكِيلًا. Meaning, be firm on Tawheed, do not attribute others to me. And then it continues very interestingly, it says, ذُرِّيَّةٌ مَنْ حَمَلْنَا مَعَ نُوحٍ. The progeny of the one that we carried with Nuh. This is very interesting. Allah speaking about Musa. Then He's throwing you back hundreds of years, and He says there was a person who we carried with who? With Nuh alayhi salam. إِنَّهُ كَانَ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا. That indeed Nuh alayhi salam was a very, very, very thankful servant. Now the story of Nuh alayhi salam is something else. Hundreds and hundreds of years he's doing da'wah, he's doing tabligh to his people. He goes through all of that torment, that humiliation. One of the blessings that Allah gives Nuh is He blesses his dhurriyyah. He blesses his lineage. And that's why the verse says, ذُرِّيَّةَ مَنْ حَمَلْنَا مَعَ نُوحٍ. With Nuh alayhi salam on the ship was his son called Shim. Or in English they say Sam. And that's why Arabs and Bani Isra'il, they call themselves Semites, because they trace their lineage back to the son of Nuh, who was called Shim. He was a very great man, a very well-respected man, a muttaqi, someone who had a lot of taqwa. But this blessing that Allah gave to Nuh continued through his lineage, and it came to Bani Isra'il. That out of appreciation, Allah is shukur. He is the one who continues to thank. He is the one who is appreciative. Every little that you do, Allah showers you with so much that we don't even appreciate it. We don't even begin to fathom how much Allah responds to the goodness that we do. One of the ideas here, or some Mufassirin, they say that the blessings of Bani Isra'il started with Nuh alayhi salam. And because of what? Nuh did. And there are other ideas as well, that it came also to Ibrahim, that when Allah gave a covenant and a promise, إِنِّي جَاعِلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا, that Ibrahim says, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي. And then Allah says, yes, that will happen, but not those who are Zalimin. So again, a combination of Nuh and Ibrahim we have. Okay, then moving on here, was this blessing permanent? And these are just themes I appreciate. I'm building into the story very slowly, because as we go through, having known this, the story becomes easier later on. When we see what Bani Isra'il get up to, how they treat Musa alayhi salam, the things that happen, the events that happen, knowing all of these beforehand will make the story in the coming sessions very, very, a lot more easier. Here are two verses from Surah Al-Ma'idah. وَلَقَدْ أَخَذَ اللَّهُ مِيثَاقَ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. وَلَقَدْ أَخَذَ اللَّهُ مِيثَاقَ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. That certainly Allah took a covenant from the children of Israel, from Bani Isra'il. And we appointed from among them 12 leaders. Again, going back to the idea of the 12 tribes. Even when Musa alayhi salam is now with Bani Isra'il in the wilderness traveling, he hits the rock in the Qur'an and streams come out. And each tribe knew where their drinking pot was. So the Qur'an itself affirms this idea of the 12 tribes, that each tribe had a role to play in their story. وَقَالَ اللَّهُ إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ. Allah says, I am with you. Allah is giving a promise, a confirmation, a guarantee to Bani Isra'il. إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ. But it doesn't stop there. لَإِن, if you establish. لَإِن أَقَمْتُمُ الصَّلَاةِ وَآتَيْتُمُ الزَّكَاةِ وَآمَنْتُمْ بِرُسُلِي, etc., etc. So Allah says, I am with you if. It was always a conditional covenant. Banu Isra'il had their side to uphold, and Allah in response was going to uphold His side. And it was made very clear, both in the Qur'an, this is clear, even in the Bible you have passages, I haven't brought them, but yeah, in the Bible you have passages that say this very clearly, that they have betrayed the covenant for what they did, they are going to be humiliated. And then the verse continues in the following verse. So because of their breaking of the covenant, فَبِمَا نَقْضِهِمْ مِيثَاقَهُمْ لَعَنَّاهُمْ وَجَعَلْنَا قُلُوبَهُمْ قَاسِيَةً. Because of their breaking of the covenant, we cursed them. And we made their hearts very hard. And the verse continues, they distort words, etc. It goes into some of the reasons why Allah took this blessing away, but we will get to that in the story. Now, as I start this story now, that was just the introduction. We're now going to jump in now into a little bit of history. The method that I'm going to use, I want to explain here what exactly you can expect from me and how I'm going to lay out this discussion. The first thing is I'm going to use the verses of the Qur'an as my benchmarks. This is how I'm going to do it. When you go into history, especially the history of the prophets, you find a lot of material. There is a lot of material. Some of it is reliable, some of it is not reliable, some of it is very contradictory perhaps to what we believe in our aqaid as to how prophets should behave or what we expect from prophets. One of the key things in any discussion, especially historically, when to do with the Anbiya, is that it should be benchmarked and polled by verses in the Qur'an. So what I will do is make sure that I am using the verses of the Qur'an as the skeleton, so that we have a safe point to rely on. These are not things that I'm taking from here and there, or I'm trying to reconstruct history in a way that sounds very odd and very strange. No, I'm going with the Quranic verses as our starting and our helping poles as we go along. So at times we will be required to go into traditions and history and even biblical sources to help build the details. Why? Because the history that we have from the Quran is not that meaty. It's very thin. It allows us to build a broad image, a broad picture about what happens, but to fill in the details, we have to go into history a little bit. And we'll see some examples as we go along today. So what I will do is do my best to bring traditions that are reliable and at the same time support it with historical information and as well as biblical sources and biblical history, because there's a lot of work that has been done by Christian scholars and Jewish scholars when it comes to reconstructing what exactly happened in this time. One thing also to keep in mind, and this is just perhaps more of a general point, that when you're discussing history, it's not possible in general now. I'm saying take us outside of religious history, even when it comes to natural history, secular history, it's not possible to get complete certainty in all the details. It's not possible to get complete certainty in all the details. What happens is you'll have established facts, then you'll have details where the reliability will reduce a little bit. So for example, even if you take modern events, take COVID for example. COVID is something that happened in our lifetime. It caused absolute chaos in the entire world. Yet when it comes to COVID, we're still asking millions of questions. No one even knows what happened. Was it a lab leak? Was it from that wet market in Wuhan where they were selling pangolins, I believe was the animal that was being sold? Who knows? Who was involved? How dangerous was it? What scientists were? These are things that we can question today. This just happened just in our lifetime. Then you go to World War II, for example, you start asking questions about World War II. I won't open that box, but I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. Certain incidents in World War II, if you question them, even though there are a lot of details, it's ambiguous. We know who the players were, we know who the victims were, but when it comes to the details, what number, there's huge question marks. And in fact, these question marks are so large, you're not allowed to ask them. You're not allowed to ask them. Why? And this is just the nature of history. History is itself ambiguous at times. There are established facts. But then when you want to establish or reconstruct the details, you'll struggle. You'll struggle. And we have this, we just finished Muharram as well. We have this in Karbala, for example. I don't want to go into that discussion, but I'm sure you are all aware, being members of the community, there are some scholars who might say a certain narrative of what happened. There are others who might say, well, actually, that didn't happen. Hey man, we hear both sides and we think, what happened? But we have to appreciate that when it comes to history, there are areas that we can say 100% happened. Then there are areas where we have to say, based on this source, this happened. Based on that source, that happened. If I don't agree with that source, then that detail isn't correct. But it doesn't mean the main event didn't happen. It just meant that specific incident didn't happen, according to my understanding. This is history. And this is one of the features of history that we have to appreciate. And again, this is sort of following on from the last point, is if we hear things, and this is relevant to this discussion or these talks that I'm going to give, because there may be things that you hear for the first time and you think, how is that possible? That's very odd. But it's not the case that you should dismiss it straight away. When it comes to history, you need to keep a room of plausibility, in particular for those events that don't necessarily have to do with your theology. And this is important to recognize. When it comes to historical events or historical incidents that directly impact your aqa'id and your theology, then it's fair to hold a red line and say, well, actually, this goes against what I believe. If someone comes and says, for example, that Jesus alayhi salam didn't exist, or Dawood didn't exist, Sulaiman didn't exist, and even though you might think this is odd, there is a huge branch of history that deals with Exodus and the Bani Isra'il, and they are atheists, and they insist that this story never happened. They insist that this story never happened. In fact, they bring their evidence to say this is all made up, for example. Or there are others who say the flood of Nuh never happened. And again, this is quite hard to prove it historically. I don't want to open this discussion, but I'm giving an example. That there are historians out there who say the flood of Nuh never happened. In fact, the flood of Nuh was the religious adaptation of a pagan folklore or a myth. There was a myth at that time of a flood. It's called the flood of Gilgamesh. It then found its way into the religious narrative. This is a historic argument. This is an argument that attacks our aqa'id completely. So we say, hold on a second, no, this didn't happen. According to our understanding, no, the Qur'an is very clear, the flood happened, the Qur'an is very clear, Dawood existed, the Qur'an is very clear, Sulaiman existed, more than the Qur'an, X, Y, and Z. This is a historical discussion that directly impacts theology. But then if someone comes and says, well, actually in the life of Musa alayhi salam, this happened, okay, what's your source? What's the evidence? You see the difference between the two. One directly relates to something that we are required to believe in, the existence of the Prophet, the actual happening of an event that we know for sure happened. And the other might be to do with a small specific incident that neither changes here, neither nor there. So that is the method. Okay, so now the next question is, how did Bani Isra'il end up in Egypt? How did they end up in Egypt? So we're going to start this with Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we're going to go all the way back to Ibrahim. Now Ibrahim alayhi salam was born in Iraq, modern Iraq today, in a town or a city called Ur. Now Ur was the capital or a big city in the Sumerian civilization, the earliest civilization known. He lived there, he was in a cave, he came out of the cave, that's how he was born, because they were worried about there was a threat against the life of the newborns. Similar to what happens in the story of Bani Isra'il. Ibrahim, he is born, he spends his early youth in the cave. He comes out into a society now where people are idol worshipping. And you know the story very well. He comes out into the society, people are worshipping idols. He then says, who are these idols? What are these idols? Ma hadhihi tamathil. What are these idols that you are worshipping? And his uncle Azar tells him, well, son or nephew, this is the way that we are. And Ibrahim, he finds it very difficult. He can't accept that people are worshipping idols. He is someone who is a muwahhid through and through. He is the champion of Tawheed. So when he sees the community worshipping idols, he takes it personally. And the story continues. He gets his idol, so he gets his hammer. He breaks the idols, you know the story. Then they gather Ibrahim. They say, how do we punish him? They make the fire. They throw him in the fire. The fire now becomes cool. Okay, that's Ibrahim. His chapter in Iraq, in Ur. Ibrahim still has a long way of his life to go. He's got a very long life, very eventful life. What happens? He now travels into Canaan, the land known as Canaan. Very interestingly, in the Qur'an, about 3 or 4 times, Ibrahim says what? Inni hajirun ila rabbi, inni dhahibun ila rabbi. I am now migrating to my Lord. I am now traveling to my Lord. He will guide me. In another verse, Allah says, وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ وَلُوطًا إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهِ. We then delivered. This is chapter 21, I believe, Surah Al-Anbiya. Allah says, after the event of Nimrud, we now took Ibrahim and we put him into the land that we blessed. What is the land that they blessed? Canaan, Philistine, that land in the Levant. So now Ibrahim, if you look at the map in the red line, he now travels up through Turkey. And in fact, biblical sources track this very nicely. He goes up through Turkey, then back down into Canaan, into what we would say is perhaps northern Palestine today. There is where the next chapter of his life starts. Lut alayhi salam is sent to Sodom and Gomorrah. The story is clear, I'm not going to go into that, what happens there. Ibrahim is given the glad tidings of a child. The child then grows up. You can see there's a line down into Hijaz, into Kaaba, into Mecca. Ibrahim alayhi salam then builds the Kaaba with his son Ismail. You have the whole event of the slaughtering of Ismail. That didn't actually happen, he was replaced. Then Ibrahim alayhi salam, he returns back into Canaan and he settles again into Levant, Sham, Philistine, that area, whatever you want to call it. We won't call it by another name. Levant, Sham, we'll leave it that way. Interestingly, in Hadith, it says that Ibrahim also traveled into Egypt. But I haven't put that into the map because again, this is something from Hadith that I can't really reliably authenticate to say that he did it. I wasn't very confident to see that it will happen. But again, there is another chapter of Ibrahim's life where he goes into Egypt. And when you read the biblical sources as well, it's quite, it's very interesting. The Bible actually doesn't mention anything about Ibrahim in Ur, meaning where he began. There's nothing in the Bible about him and the idols. There's nothing about him and the fire, which is an interesting addition from the Qur'an. So when people say that the Qur'an is a copy of the Bible, well actually there's a huge chunk of Ibrahim's life that is not even there in the Bible. The fire is a huge monumental event in Ibrahim's life, nothing there. So anyway, so then we have Ibrahim alayhi salam, he rests and he settles in Canaan. That's his final resting place. In Hebron, which is occupied Palestine, this is now in the West Bank, there is a site called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. You can see the picture of what it looks like now, and that's kind of like an AI image I took from Googling it online. You can see there are the graves. There's the grave of Ibrahim, there's the grave of Ishaq, and then there's Sarah, I believe, and then there's Rebecca, who was the wife of Ishaq as well. So that's kind of the ziyarah place that if you have inshallah in the future, when the whole land is free, we can go and do our ziyarah to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And there's interesting stories around that sort of area. When the Muslims conquered, they then built mosques around it. The Crusaders then came and destroyed the mosques, and it's got a little bit of its own history. But Ibrahim alayhi salam with his son and others are buried there in Palestine. Okay, so then you have Ibrahim. Ibrahim alayhi salam now returns back and he's buried, he dies in Sham, in the Levant. Then you have the story of Yusuf. So now Ibrahim, Ishaq and Yaqub, they continue to live in that area. They are living in the Levant, in Sham, in that area. Then you have the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Now Yusuf was taken, he was thrown into the well. From the well he gets taken out, he gets thrown, then he gets sold to traders. The traders then take him into Egypt. When he gets into Egypt, he goes into Memphis. Now Memphis was the city which was the capital administration of the government at the time. Not the Pharaoh of the time. Interesting, when the Qur'an refers to the ruler, it calls him Malik, the king of the time, not the Pharaoh, the king of the time. That's where the capital was of his government. Now he lives there. I'm not going to go into the story. You know the story. Yusuf alayhi salam, he spends many years. He's in prison for a number of years. He comes out of prison, then he gets nobility, and then you have the whole story of how he calls back his brothers. His father then returns back. And then what happens at the end of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam is that they all now move from Sham and they come and they join Yusuf alayhi salam in Egypt. Now when they come into Egypt, Yusuf alayhi salam, his position is so high and he is so loved and he is so well respected by the Malik, by the king, that the king says, I will give any piece of land you want for your family. Any piece of land, you name it. So long as I have sovereignty over that land, so long as that's within my boundaries, I will give it to you. They chose this land called Goshen. Now why they chose this land and where exactly this part is referenced, this is spoken about within the Bible, and we have some traditions about this too. They chose a land called Goshen. Why? Because they were a people who had many sheep. Agriculture was quite a big thing. Herding their sheep was quite a big thing. They wanted land. Goshen was a piece of open land that would allow them to graze their animals freely. This was a lifestyle that they were used to in the Levant, in Canaan. And that's a lifestyle they wanted to continue when they came to Egypt. Interestingly as well, the Egyptians didn't really take kindly to this sort of trade or doing this. They were more, their type of business was a little bit different. But nevertheless, they were then given this land called Goshen. And they continued to live there. And when they entered, in the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, they were treated like nobility. They were given huge respect. And that's quite clear from how they were given so much land. They were able to bring everyone from Sham, and they all came and they resided in Egypt. Now that's how the story of Yusuf alayhi salam ends, on a very high and happy note. But now we get into the context of Musa alayhi salam. So where are we? The Bani Isra'il is living happily, respected in Egypt. How is it that they went from royalty to slavery? This is perhaps the first question in the story of Musa alayhi salam. How is it that Bani Isra'il went from being treated so nicely and respected to being slaves? Now interestingly, this is from a hadith in Bihar al-Anwar. When Yusuf alayhi salam was on his deathbed, he gives a warning to the heads of his family. In the hadith it says he called 80 members of the heads of Bani Isra'il at the time, 80. And he said to them, great hardship is to befall you. These Egyptians will subjugate you and inflict a terrible torment on you. Your men will be murdered. Your newborn boys will be slaughtered. And this will continue until God reveals the truth through one who will rise up from the descendants of Levi. Again, so if you remember, we said when we spoke about the tribes, Levi's tribe was the one that was responsible for the prophets and the clerics, not the kings and prophets. The prophet kings came from Judah, the cleric prophets came from Levi. So this is the tradition we have in Bihar al-Anwar. Now again, it begs the question, how is it that they went from royalty to slavery? Now the time from Yusuf alayhi salam to Musa alayhi salam is about 300 to 400 years. So it's still quite some time. But even still, they dropped in society. Their standing dropped a little bit. How did that happen? Interestingly, there's a passage in the Exodus now. So we're going to the Bible to understand a little bit on how this might have happened. Oh gosh, I can't read this from here. Let me open up my phone. So this is in the Bible. This is the Exodus. It says, then a new king came to power in Egypt. Yusuf didn't mean anything to him. So you had a new dynasty come to power in Egypt. When Yusuf alayhi salam was the king and royalty, there was a specific type of administration in Egypt. There was a revolution in Egyptian history. A new political power came in. That political power had a new understanding, a new opinion on Bani Isra'il. They had forgotten, they no longer remembered what Yusuf alayhi salam had done. The new power, the new administration that came in, no longer remembered. So this passage says, then a new king came to power in Egypt. Yusuf didn't mean anything to him. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites are far too many for us. So at this time, according to some numbers, they're a sizable figure. The Bani Isra'il in Egypt are at least a couple of 100,000. The numbers when they actually left Egypt, some numbers go up to 1 to 2 million. So you're looking at a very large size of people. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites, Bani Isra'il, are far too many for us. Come, we must deal with them carefully. If we don't, there will be even more of them. That if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies. They'll fight against us and leave the country. So if you look at the map, you'll see that Egypt at the time of Bani Isra'il had a number of different enemies. They had enemies in the south. Egypt, they had enemies in the south, which is today's Sudan. They had enemies in the Levant as well. And in fact, one of the earliest historically recorded wars that took place was a war that happened between Egypt and the enemies in the south. It's called the Battle of Magdesh or something. So anyways, Egypt had a number of wars with its external neighbors. They were now worried that Banu Isra'il, that is in our midst, could in fact support our enemies. And if they do that, they will undermine us. So we need to deal with this insider threats. And this actually happens in war quite often. Those who remember from World War II, if you've read the history, there was a time where America set up internment camps for whoever was Japanese. If you type in World War II internment camps, anyone who was Japanese Americans, the Americans took them and put them into a camp. Why? Because they said, we're now at war with Japan. If we have Japanese Americans living in the land, God forbid they're going to damage us from the inside, we need to deal with it. So this mentality happens. When you're in war, or you're in constant war, you look at certain minority groups as threats. Why? Because they don't have the loyalty to the Egyptians. Bani Isra'il were from a different ethnicity to the Egyptians. They were Semites. They came from Sham, from Levant. These Egyptians were sort of Africans, if you can imagine, whatever different time. So there was no commonality between the two, and there was a worry that actually if we don't deal with them, then when the time comes and we're now at war, they could be a threat. Interestingly, we have hadith that say that Pharaoh, he actually saw a dream. Now this is another explanation. So one explanation that is historically given, that is supported by the biblical narrative, is that Pharaoh saw them as a threat, and he wanted to deal with them. He wanted to reduce their numbers. The second narrative, which we have in our hadith, that kind of overlaps again with the suspicion that you see in the historical accounts, is Pharaoh saw a dream. In this dream, he saw a fire coming from the Levant, coming from Sham. And this fire came to Egypt and it destroyed everyone's houses except the houses of Bani Isra'il. So he woke up, he told this dream to his advisors, and his advisors said, Bani Isra'il are going to be your downfall. If you do not deal with them now, with the numbers that they have, they are going to rise against you. And because of that, he then decided to persecute them. And this is where you have that Pharaoh started to kill their sons and spare their women, etc. There is another idea that is put out, and I in fact heard this today from a scholar who I was listening to, a Shia scholar, a contemporary Shia scholar who I was listening to. His idea is that Bani Isra'il started to commit fasad in Egypt. Okay, so from the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, they now come in with Yusuf. They are living there under Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf alayhi salam now passes away, and Bani Isra'il now commit fasad. And you're looking at all sorts of fasad. You're looking at financial fasad. You're looking at fasad to do with relations between a man and a woman. All sorts of fasad, social fasad. And because of this, Pharaoh then was motivated to do something about it, because they were causing a problem on the wider society. Now this is a theory, I heard it today from a scholar, I won't say who, I won't say why to give it support. I have heard it from other sources. The problem I have with this theory is, again, it has no historical backing. Neither in our hadith, neither have I found anything historically to support this, neither is there anything in any biblical narrative whatsoever. It's almost like this scholar is looking at Bani Israel now and saying, I know the character of those people. They must have done something to annoy Pharaoh. Otherwise, why would they have gone from royalty to being slaves? There's no smoke without a fire. They did something to deserve it. Now again, it's an interesting idea. It's one I don't completely dismiss. It's slightly plausible, but again, it needs more support for me to actually come out and say, I agree with this idea. This is just a thought. And you might hear it again if you listen to scholars speak or discuss this topic. They might support this idea. It's important to ask them, if you get the chance, where are you getting this from? Or for you to think, is this possible? Did this happen? In my opinion, it did. Most likely it was a combination of both of these. Pharaoh saw a dream, or not necessarily a dream. He might have heard of the prophecy being told that Bani Israel will be saved. And at the same time, there's a lot of wars going on. And in fact, in the biblical narrative, which is very interesting, and we'll get into this in the life of Musa, Musa alayhi salam was tasked, according to the biblical narrative. I'm not saying this is supported directly by the Qur'an, and again, according to my method, I'll make this clear. This is not a Qur'anic understanding. In the biblical narrative and biblical history, Musa alayhi salam actually took part in some of these wars on behalf of Pharaoh. And this is where he became to be known for his bravery and his strength and his power. And in fact, in the palace, it was seen that Musa is blessed with a different physique. He's not like the normal Egyptians. And we see that in his story, one punch and he kills someone. It takes a very strong man to be able to do that without an accident happening. Normally in today's world, you see examples, someone gets punched, his head, he falls and then he hits his head, and it's like, no, Musa killed him with one punch, very clearly. And he killed someone who was a guard. This is not someone who was weak and old and frail. No, it was someone who was ready for physical altercation. Physical fight. Musa punched him and he fell and he killed and he died. So Musa alayhi salam was known for being physically strong and brave, and in the biblical history he was known for commanding an army. And it's very interesting. We'll get into this, but I think this gives us context to the warlike conditions that Egypt, and it might have influenced Pharaoh's understanding. But again, beyond that, we don't exactly know. And this is one of those questions that I mentioned earlier, that history will get you so far. Then there are parts you have to say, I have a theory. Beyond that theory, I don't know. How is it that they went from nobility to slavery? I've given 3 different ideas or hypotheses as to how that might have happened. Which one was it? Allah. Each one has its own strengths, and then you have to see which one fits and which one doesn't. Okay. So now we go into how the Quran describes Pharaoh. So now we're in this environment. Bani Israel are now living in Egypt. They are in their own district. They are living separately to the Egyptians, but they are under extreme persecution. Extreme persecution. They are being violated. There is injustice happening. They are being oppressed. Wherever they work, they're not allowed to keep. They are being treated as slaves. From morning to evening, they are being made to work. They return back home. They sleep. They wake up, and it continues. That is their life. Being treated like cattle almost by Pharaoh. And here is one verse where Allah is describing Pharaoh. He says, Inna Fir'aun ala fil ard. That indeed Pharaoh, he exalted himself in the land. وَجَعَلَ أَهْلُهَا شِيَعًا. And he divided his people into factions. So one of the methods that Pharaoh used was divide and conquer. He knew that certain people in society were of a different ethnicity, he treated them in one way. Those of a different ethnicity, he treated in another way. And this is a policy that continued through time. The British were amazing at it, weren't they? Divide and conquer. You come into a land, what's the easiest way to destroy it? You get one people to fight another people. This is the sin of Pharaoh. يستضعف طائفة منهم يذبح أبناءهم ويستحيي نساءهم إنه كان من المفسدين. And indeed, he killed one group. He slaughtered their sons. He spared their women. And indeed, he was one of those who did fasad. And again, I won't go into details, but the Mufassirin, when they look at sparing the women, you know what's being referred to here. That the women were treated in specific ways that were not humane. Then there is another verse, and I will finish today's talk with this, when describing Pharaoh. And this is from Surah Al-Fajr. وَفِرَعَوْنَ ذِي الْأَوْتَادِ. And Pharaoh, the possessor of stakes, or utad, pegs, or sticks. Now our Mufassirin have three opinions as to what this means. What does this alert to? What is it being spoken about here? One, is this referring to his great structures? Now Pharaoh is being described by the Qur'an as something that defines him now. What is it about Pharaoh that defines him? Well, his great structures. Depending on which Pharaoh we believe was the Pharaoh at the time of Musa, and that again is another historical discussion, which I won't get into now. I think we've done a lot of history today. Perhaps when we get to the last part where Pharaoh is thrown out of the river, we can look into who exactly was this Pharaoh. But one of the features here Allah wants to bring attention to is this Pharaoh. He is a possessor of stakes. These pigs, he has plenty of these long, tall sticks. What does it mean? Well, one opinion is it refers to great structures. The pharaohs of Egypt, they loved to build monuments. And this Pharaoh in particular, he had a specific affinity for big buildings. One of the verses in the Quran that supports this opinion is when he turns to Haman, Pharaoh. He turns to Haman and he says, build for me a tower. Again, this is a man who knows how to build towers. He has confidence, he has familiarity. His people around him know how to build things. So he was a man who was known for building things, build monuments, these vanity projects, as you call them, isn't it? So that's one opinion. The second opinion given is military camps. When you want to make barracks or you want tents for soldiers to sleep in, you've got to hammer those tents down with what? The pegs for those things. So this is one other interpretation given. And again, I mentioned before that Egypt was in constant war with different enemies. It had an enemy in Sham, in Levant. It had an enemy down south in modern-day Sudan. And therefore it had barracks and army camps everywhere. And it was well known that this Pharaoh was known as a military leader. He had barracks, he had soldiers, and he was particularly known for having large soldiers and large barracks. The third opinion, which is perhaps in my opinion the strongest, and we have a hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam on this, is that he used to torture people this way. And we also have in our tradition that Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, was killed in this manner. Without going into too much detail about how the killing would happen, feet and hands and sticks. That's what I would say. But in the story of Pharaoh and the magicians, for example, what does he say to them? لَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ, I'm going to crucify you. So again, this is a man who is used to killing people in horrendous ways. And we have hadith that support the third opinion, or when Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is asked about this, he gives this opinion. And that's why when it comes to the tradition, this verse in particular, I would take the third one. That doesn't necessarily mean he didn't have neither of the other two. It just means his defining feature was his killing. He was a man who loved to kill. But not only would he kill, he would kill in horrendous and vicious ways. In ways that were meant to instill fear. That he would crucify you and then leave that body there. So that you walking past can see that if I behave like that person, I'm going to end up like that person. That's a way to instill fear, isn't it? There's one thing to say, I will threaten you. It's another thing to say, I'm going to kill you, then that person that is killed will be the threat that you will see from me. And this is the sort of environment in which Bani Isra'il were living. They were terrified. But at the same time, they had hope that Musa-like figure would come. And they had that iman. Well, some of them had the iman, others were quite hopeless. But at the end of the day, it was a very difficult time for them. And that's why when Musa alayhi salam comes, that was a huge, huge blessing that took them out of this. So I'll leave that there. I think we've spoken for a while. Do we now have question and answers? Is that? So I'll open up. Inshallah, if you have. I'm sure there's probably quite a lot of questions. I can't say I have the answer for them all, but we can brainstorm, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Sheikh, for a beautiful lecture. If there are any questions either on the brother's side or the sister's side, then please do raise your hand.
There's a confusion in my head. Children of Israel is, when we say children of Israel, are we referring to the 12 tribes? Because we also have children of Imran, right? And from that map we looked at the hierarchy. Prophet Musa came from Imran, right? And then we have also have Judah. So just want to clear, when we say children of Israel, are we referring to Yaqub alayhi salam, or are we referring to this Israel?
So the question was asked, who are we referring to when we mentioned Bani Isra'il? So if you want the mic for a question. Could you pass the mic to the sister side? I think it's oh, it's putting on battery there. Oh, it's not working. Is the mic not working? Sorry, the mic's not working, so feel free to just call out your question and then I can...
You give your mic to them.
Okay.
And you use this one.
Sure. If the sisters want to come and take this mic, you can use that for your questions, and I have another mic here. So yeah, that's partly my fault. I should have explained it a little bit more. Bani Isra'il, when we're referring to Bani Isra'il here, we're referring to the lineage from Yaqub that continues all the way up until when he gets closed off by Isa alayhi salam. So within these are hundreds of years. You can imagine it now refers to many people. We're looking at hundreds of thousands and millions plus. When it comes to your other comment about Ali Imran, it's very similar to how you look at Quraysh and Banu Hashim. There is a wider unit or a wider group, and then within that group there's a smaller unit. So you could say, for example, Banu Hashim are blessed in a specific way that doesn't extend to everyone inside the Quraysh. You see what I mean? It's that kind of relation.
So was Imran a person? Or was it a tribe?
No, so Imran was a person. So he was the father of Musa alayhi salam, and he was the father of Maryam. But again, sometimes because the same name is used, people mistake to think that they are quite closely connected. That, from my understanding, that's not. They were two separate people, two separate times. If the sisters have any questions, feel free to ask. No? Okay. Brothers, got any more questions?
At the time of Musa, you mentioned the Samiri.
Yes, some yes.
Yes, that happened exactly the time when the Musa was there. The same story,
Yes.
same materials, isn't it?
Yes, so the story of Samiri that I mentioned at the beginning and the context in which I mentioned it was that the Qur'an has come to clarify certain details that we have in the Bible, or at least were popular amongst Ahlul Kitab. One of the stories that we have in the Bible is that when Bani Isra'il wanted to make the golden calf, they asked Harun, and Harun did it. Now for us this is not acceptable. Harun alayhi salam didn't do it. And the Quran has come to verify and correct this story. That this story is it's so blasphemous that the Prophet Allah wants to correct it now to preserve the honor of Harun. So within the story, in our understanding, or as how it happened, it was Samiri who did it. Now this happens after they leave Egypt. And Musa alayhi salam, he leaves his people to go and receive the Torah or the Ten Commandments, and he leaves Harun in charge. And inshallah we'll get there, maybe in part 4, part 5. So I want to too much.
Are there any questions?
Any other questions?
Mashkoor, yes. Mashkoor, Sheikh. Now this is very, very interesting, and it's bringing history to life through the eyes of the Quran and your good self. Just a couple of observations. Is that we have a lot of traditions in our hadith. There are the Jews, from the Jews, which is embedded, so much so we even hear those from our members at times. So we need to be very careful and clarify those type of that, pointed that out. Because in early Islam, after the Holy Prophet's passing away, number 2, is a lot of the Israeli who was very much in Pharaoh to bring in the Jewish traditions into Hakiki Islam. To Hakiki Islam. The other thing which I really love the fact is that you are showing a timeline. Now, most of us have seen the movie The Ten Commandments. And it's a very interesting movie. There's a lot of facts. But for example, it shows when Nabi Musa comes to Pharaoh and gives him the warnings, and Pharaoh doesn't listen. And then there are the adabs of Allah that come through. Now, from the biblical perspective, and also maybe from the movies, which they base it on facts, that after a while, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month maximum, Pharaoh gave in and said, no, I can't take any more of these azab, go, take your tribe. But actually it is like 40 years after that the exodus actually happened, after those, the curses or the warnings of Allah, the river turning into blood, the locusts, the frogs, all those azabs. So when you come to that, when you do that, if you give us that timeline, we really appreciate it. A lot of extra work for you.
Jazakallah. So on the first point relating to Israeliyat, that is a huge problem. And I should have touched on the method slide, I left it out, purely because I didn't want to get into it. Because once you get into it, it's kind of like a minefield. Now, when we look at the history of our prophets, there are a number of sources that we have to go through. The first is the Qur'an. When you go to the Qur'an, you can see the stories mentioned clearly. وَظُنُّونَ إِذْ ذَهَبَ مُغَاضِبًا. Okay, so Yunus alayhi salam, something happened there. And then you have Isa alayhi salam. You have various stories. What happened is our hadith compilations that we have, the books in particular that absorbed and adopted these ahadith, they didn't do so with keeping in mind certain requirements. Mm-hmm. And one massive book in particular, a very useful resource, but at the end of the day, the intention was not to compile traditions meticulously, is Bihar al-Anwar. So for example, the significant amount of hadith that you would need to build a actual really detailed understanding come from Bihar al-Anwar. So for those who are interested, there is a book called God's Emissaries by Sheikh Rizwan Arastu. And it's been written in English. It's been, if you search it online, you can actually buy yourself a copy. It's a very nice book. What he does is he does this from Nabi Adam alayhi salam all the way to Nabi Isa alayhi salam, and he builds a story. Now, his main source for doing it all is pretty much Bihar al-Anwar. And we don't have alternative sources when it comes to hadith, or when we want to look at things from a hadith perspective. Now that doesn't mean we have a problem. It just means we need to be very careful when taking these traditions. And I gave the example of Yusuf alayhi salam. We have within our books this hadith that prophethood was taken from the lineage of Yusuf because of the way he behaved, his disrespect for his father. This is something I've said during the talk. I said I disagree with this. But we can't escape that it's within our books. Now, how did this hadith come into our books? Well, the compilers of the hadith, their main concern was preservation. They felt, let me go and gather as many ahadith as we can to make sure that these hadith, at least we can keep them. Not necessarily that I endorse them, I condone them, I support them. And this was perhaps the philosophy behind Bihar al-Anwar, his encyclopedic hadith work. But nevertheless, when you have such a vast net, you're going to catch lots of good things, and you're going to catch lots of perhaps not so good things. So when it comes to building a narrative or building history, we need to keep in mind that there is this genre of hadith or type of hadith called Isra'iliyat. Now, Isra'iliyat are either fabrications that came from individuals who are known either openly or were acting under the guard of Islam, but were hidden, and they were saying ahadith to tamper with our ahadith corpus and even to bring down the position of some of the Anbiya. This was a phenomenon that happened early on in history. Interestingly, when I gave that third interpretation of why Bani Isra'il were turned into slaves, in that they were behaving in ways that were creating fasad in Egypt and Pharaoh was now punishing them, the scholar who I was listening to, he said the reason why we don't have the ahadith to speak about this is because in the first few centuries, or the first century, there was a hadith ban by number two, and the scholars that were involved around those responsible for the hadith ban were inclined to Bani Isra'il, and they made sure that this wasn't brought in. Again, this is history. I don't necessarily agree with it. But I'm just saying there is this opinion out there. In terms of the timeline, yes, one of the things I wanted to get across today is things happened over time. When we read the Qur'an and we relate to the stories of the Prophet, it's very flat. You just read it in one verse and you skip through it and you past it. But in fact, the way the Qur'an wants to build a story is beautiful. It comes at different angles. You have the story of Musa alayhi salam in Surah Taha. The story of Surah Taha, for example, starts when Musa alayhi salam, he sees the burning bush. But then you come to Surah Al-Qasas, it starts in a different way. You turn to Surah Al-Shu'ara, it starts in a different way. Where every time Allah wants to bring you a different dimension of what's going on. He wants to make the story as live for you as possible. And again, having a timeline is helpful. It helps us at least structure it in our minds so we can appreciate how history develops. And again, as we go through the story of Musa alayhi salam, you'll see things unfold. Like you said, many years pass. Bani Isra'il, even after Musa alayhi salam comes, and they have the duel with the sticks, and the stick turns into snake, and Musa is victorious, and Pharaoh is embarrassed. Even after that, many years pass. Such to the extent that Bani Isra'il, they turn to Musa after everything happened, and they say to Musa, our life before you was better. Imagine. And this is what we'll get to. This is why the story of Musa alayhi salam is amazing. Because they really go from highs to lows to highs to lows. And then you see what kind of people Musa alayhi salam is dealing with. Such that we have in the Quran that Musa alayhi salam, he looks at his people and he says, Lima tu'dunani? Like, why do you upset me? And you know I'm the Prophet of Allah to you and you treat me like this. This is Musa alayhi salam, he got to a point where he was like, how can you treat me like this after all of this time? Anyways, there are many years that pass, and inshallah that's something that we'll cover.